Well, good evening, everyone. I wanted to thank you for tuning in for the second part of the reading of my chapter from the book Behind the Power Your Success is Waiting on You. Now, last night I read the first couple sections of the book, and where we ended up was me realizing that the second marriage that I had to Janet wasn't working out, and I ended up filing for divorce. Was a very difficult period for the both of us. However, I think it was the best decision for both of us overall, and I know we've both moved on to bigger and better things. So there was a positive outcome to that story, even though it's not in the chapter. Now, tonight, I'm going to be reading the next two sections. The first part is called The Uniform, which I think would be part 3. And then I'm going to talk about part 4, which is what I call a brief interlude. So, the greatest love of my life was the United States Coast Guard. For more than 3 decades, I proudly served the American public, first as a radio communicator, then as an information technology expert, and finally as an executive manager for all New England personnel. I sailed aboard ships, managed communication centers, coordinated multi-million-dollar contracts, and developed critical software packages. More importantly, I saved lives, both directly and indirectly. In 1989, for instance, I coordinated the rescue of 23 people off the Star of Alexandria, a cargo ship that capsized and sank off the coast of Cape Cod during foul weather. I was recognized for my efforts with a citation for outstanding service. It was only one of many citations I would receive for excellence. The Coast Guard, however, was also my greatest liability. The military is well suited for people pleasers and perfectionists. With its rigid structure, clear expectations, and written policies, there is little room for ambiguity. Perfectionism is not difficult to attain. Moreover, since its advancement and promotion systems are based in part on subjective narratives written by supervisory staff, people pleasing had a direct impact on rank and pay. The more people liked me, the better the narrative. The better the narrative, the more pay I would receive. So I made it easy for people to like me. I overachieved, exceeded expectations, and adeptly navigated the politics. I participated in events, volunteered for special projects, and often assumed roles that were well beyond my pay grade simply to demonstrate my value. I never said no to anything, ever. The truth was, when I put on the uniform, I transformed. That weak little boy, the one who accepted the belt, feared the paddle, and fixated on every little mistake he made, was replaced by a confident, capable, and respected man. I felt untouchable because I followed the rules, had authority, and was willing to be whatever the Coast Guard wanted me to be. And I was highly effective. As I matured, I used my power to facilitate sexual assault cases, manage domestic violence situations, and coordinate decedent affairs. I assisted troubled service members with everything from indebtedness to divorce. I even led the restructuring of an entire arm of the Coast Guard to conform to Navy and Department of Homeland Security information technology standards. Unfortunately, none of this translated to my civilian life. I joined the Coast Guard when I was 19 years old, not because of any passion or interest I had for it, but because I came from a home life where I constantly felt threatened and on the brink of rejection. I believed joining the service would restart my life. I was also newly married with a child on the way. I needed stability and income, and I needed it quickly. While apprehensive about the military, I was excited to be independent and free to make my own choices. What I failed to see was how rooted my people-pleasing and perfectionistic behaviors had already become. When I graduated basic training, I immediately deployed to California to learn communications. Because the training was short, only 5 months, I asked that my wife and child not accompany me. I had no idea where I would be stationed after school, and I felt moving my family across the country would be a stressor neither one of us needed. And she disagreed. Not wanting to be, I'm sorry, not wanting her to be angry, I gave in to what she wanted. To afford the move, she sold or gave away everything we owned, including all the personal effects I had left behind. I was naturally angry, but said little because it was what she wanted. For 4 months, we lived in an empty apartment with nothing but lawn furniture and a playpen that doubled as our baby's crib. I commuted to school each day on a used moped with an expired license plate. It was the only thing we could afford. As a seagoing service, it was no surprise to learn that my first duty station would be a Coast Guard ship. What was surprising was that the ship was less than 50 miles away from the school. Despite some initial apprehensive, when I sailed, I blossomed. For months at a time, the 378-foot cutter would cruise the Pacific, all 120 of us, enforcing laws and treaties from the equator to the Arctic Circle. It was a dangerous job. One little mistake, a mishandled line, an improperly stowed life jacket, a missed distress call, affected people's lives. To fall overboard meant instant death. I devoted 18 to 20 hours a day focused on my profession. I excelled at Morse code, became a first-rate deckhand, and qualified as a multi-spectrum radio operator. I felt wanted, needed, and essential finally. When I returned to Homeport, it was a completely different story. I felt as if I was living the epitome of chaos. My wife had no schedule, no plans, and no organization. To me, her daily routine was as willy nilly as it was ungrounded, and it made me incredibly uneasy. At one point, I naively believed that I could manage my family like my job, leveraging my newly acquired personnel skills on them. My intentions were good, but my result was a disaster. Instead of resolving our problem or negotiating a compromise, I was labeled controlling, and an argument ensued. So I quickly dropped that idea. The word perfection was not in my wife's vocabulary. To her, perfection was a myth, a fable, a fairy tale. Still, imperfection worked for her. My daughter was happy and healthy, food was always on the table, and our car ran like clockwork. She was able to operate a household as a single parent with no support system for months at a time without me. Honestly, her independence was astounding. It just did not work for me. Not only was the Coast Guard reinforcing my need for perfectionism, but I also grew up in a household that had a very clear and distinct hierarchy. My father was the head of the household, and my mother subservient. Having not yet recognized this flawed model, even people pleasing became painful for me. Agreeing to her terms while living in her environment was uncomfortable and felt unsafe. Each time I returned to port, I felt like a visitor in my own home. Attempts to reconnect kept failing, conversations were awkward, and tasks were pointless. Everything I did felt like a mistake. The relationship with my first wife ended for the same reason as it did with Janet, although with less drama. No matter how much I did, it never seemed good enough. The fights, arguments, and disagreements were too much, and we parted when I received new orders. She and my daughter moved back to her home state, and I moved across country. Interlude. As the second hand of the clock ticked closer to midnight on December 31st, 1999, I stood outside an unassuming brick building on Coast Guard Island in Alameda, California. As I looked across the estuary, fireworks exploded over the city of San Francisco. They are early, I thought. I was early too. I arrived more than 2 hours ago because as a perfectionist, it was better to be exceedingly early rather than a few seconds late. Besides, I knew I had an important role to play tonight. As the sole computer technician on the island, I was charged with monitoring tens of millions of dollars worth of critical computer infrastructure for the Y2K bug. Because the data center at Coast Guard Island served as the West Coast hub for all operations in the Pacific area, if any system failed because its internal coding could not change to the year 2000, search and rescue and law enforcement activities would cease. It was an incredibly important assignment, and I had volunteered for it. By 1999, I had nearly 15 years of service, advanced 6 pay grades, and successfully transitioned from communications to information technology. I achieved multiple certifications, earned a college degree, and was considered one of the top experts in my field. My work that evening would, in fact, serve to bolster my selection as commissioned Coast Guard officer a year or so later, although I didn't know it at the time. I was absolutely the perfect person for that job, but at what cost? By 1999, I had been through 2 divorces, lost touch with family, and had no social life. I had no hobbies, never vacationed, and spent most of my free time thinking about work. My profession was my life. I had no idea that I was living for other people, and if I had, perhaps I would have avoided the affair. My years of people pleasing and perfectionism had left me feeling isolated. Yes, I had people in my life, but I never felt as if they cared about me. To me, I was a commodity that provided for them. It was a painful, wretched feeling that tugged at my soul. I constantly sought comfort to quell that pain, but nothing worked. Even alcohol proved to be useless. It was not until I met Sarah that everything changed, at least for a moment. Sarah was the wife of my supervisor. She was short, slightly overweight, and incredibly beautiful. I don't remember how it started, perhaps with the touch of her hand or a shared smile, but we instantly connected. Over the course of the next few months, we did many things together, all with her husband in tow, to simply be together. He never suspected, and we never let on. At night, we would exchange phone calls, speaking for hours about our lives, our futures, our hopes, and our dreams. It was dangerous behavior, yet I did not care. All I could think about was how much I loved her. So I did the unthinkable. I proposed that we should meet at a hotel room. My heart stopped when she said, "I would love that." For the entire drive from my apartment to the hotel, I swam in the euphoric cloud of feeling wanted. After weeks and weeks of talking, hidden caresses, and the occasional note, we were finally going to meet, alone, to consummate this beautiful thing that we had created. It felt so amazingly good, and I felt so amazingly me. We met at the hotel as planned, but something changed inside me when she walked through the door. I immediately began to question whether I was making yet another mistake. In one of the most heart-wrenching decisions of my life, I sat down next to her and broke the news that I would be walking away from us. "But why?" she said in a broken voice. I've pondered this question for decades. At the time, I told her that I had a sudden epiphany, that it felt morally irresponsible for us to continue, as it would impact both my burgeoning friendship with her husband and create significant issues with her. These words echoed my previous experience with Janet. Yes, I labeled it moral responsibility, but I was afraid of disappointing other people. I wonder now whether this was completely true. For me, one of the most unexpected side effects of perpetual people pleasing and perfectionist behaviors was hiding my true self. I hid because my opinions, wants, and needs tended to be different from those around me. Lacking the courage to be me because of childhood trauma, I let myself be overruled, undercut, and manipulated all the time. It was just easier to keep other people happy than confront them with an alternative viewpoint. As a result, my happiness became irrelevant. When it did surface, which was rare, it frightened me, so I pushed it away. I think this was the real reason I ended my affair with Sarah. I did not I did not know how to be happy. We all judge, and I'm no different. Was it socially acceptable to pursue a relationship with a married woman? Of course not. Nevertheless, there was a genuine connection, and we could have made it work despite the complexities. But I will never know. To have exposed my authentic self and been truly happy was completely unacceptable. The last thing I remember was Sarah sitting on the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her face. I never saw or heard from her again. Thank you so much for listening to this second part. Again, it's a very vulnerable story that I'm telling, and I hope in some cases you can see a little bit of yourself in me because we're all human, we all make mistakes, we all make decisions that over time we learn to regret. But the bottom line is that we're all doing the best we can, making decisions that at the time seem like the best decisions. So tomorrow I'll be finishing up the chapter. So 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, I believe now, on Facebook and YouTube. And I'd love it if you could join me. So you guys have a wonderful evening. And again, thank you so much for listening. And for those that are watching the replay or listening on Spotify, thank you so much. I appreciate it. You all have a wonderful evening.